Awareness, the final frontier. This is Awareness Explorers.
Welcome again, friends and fellow explorers, to Awareness Explorers. I'm your co-host, Jonathan Robinson, and I'm with my co-host and friend,
Brian Tom O'Connor.
And today we are going to be talking about a very important subject, one close to my heart, triggers. What triggers us, what to do about them, where they come from, what we normally do, and ways to deal with them maybe more effectively. So first question I like to ask, Brian, whenever we do something is when we talked about triggers, what was the first thing that you were triggered to come up with?
I suppose the first thought that came to my mind was that most of us think being triggered is a bad thing. And that's what I call the second arrow. The first arrow is the trigger itself and the pain that it creates. And the second arrow is the idea that we shouldn't be triggered. So I think it's quite important to look into that condition we have, that triggering should never happen. But that's easier said than done. And the second thought I had was, let's define it. Let's talk about what does it mean to be triggered? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, well, the first thought I have is, it's a negative emotion that happens due to a reaction to a thought or event that often relates not so much to the immediate thought and event, but something maybe earlier. So, if my wife says, "Can you do the dishes?" or "You didn't do your dishes," I'm not just reacting to that statement. I'm reacting to when my mom used to punish me for not doing the dishes. I used to argue with her about that. And now that is all bringing that up from the past, so that when my wife says, "You left dishes in the sink," or whatever, that I am kind of in the past, reacting to my past in the present.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think that's right on. When I hear people talk about being triggered, most often they're talking about something someone else said to them, which may or may not have been unkind. Usually it is. That brings a really strong emotional reaction that seems not necessarily equal to the present situation, but brings up, it's like, the old saying that your family knows all the buttons to push because they installed them, or
Yes,
your parents.
Yeah. And, a lot of people, as you become more aware, you also become more aware of how much you're triggered. In my prior spiritual group, we had a technique to be very aware of every negative emotion, even really subtle ones. And, I might have thought that I had, 30 negative emotions a day. And then I realized I had, maybe 600 a day. They didn't last long, they weren't big, but you start to see these more and more subtle triggers and how we're very much impacted by our past and not really living just in the moment. And that can be humbling when you're one of the reasons why it's hard to become more aware is the first thing you become aware of is that we're living in a shit show.
That's right. You do have to become aware of that and what's going on.
Yeah.
That's where you start. You start with what's in awareness right now, and it might be that I'm having a feeling that I don't want to have.
Yeah. Yeah. So another way of looking at triggers is that we all have these various rules of how things should be. And we generally don't know what those rules are. A lot of those rules are programmed from our past by our parents or society or whatever. But we have, maybe 100 shoulds, like people shouldn't interrupt me. Politicians should tell the truth. My technology should work every time, etc. Hundreds of rules. And when those rules are, quote, violated by reality, as they often are, then we are triggered into a negative emotion. I remember traveling in India where this was 30 years ago and almost nothing worked right. You know, you'd turn on the light in your hotel and it wouldn't work, and then you'd flush the toilet and it wouldn't work, and then you'd, you know, you know, try to brush your teeth with water in the sink and that wouldn't work. And eventually, so the first 10 days I was totally triggered all the time because I had all these rules that things should work. And then I just kind of gave it up, and I wasn't expecting the light to turn on. And then when the light turned on, it was like a nice surprise. Like, oh my gosh, the light works. Whereas, you know, now that I live in California, I expect everything to work and it doesn't always, and then I'm triggered. So it's kind of our beliefs, our shoulds, our rules, and of course, as we mentioned, our childhood programming and childhood trauma that can lead to triggers. So those are some of the categories I came up with. Can you add anything to that?
The categories of what do you mean by the categories?
What leads to triggers?
Oh yeah, the big one is that we have conditions for our happiness. In other words, I will be happy if such and such happens, or if such and such never happens. And in being triggered, it's the second one. Just as you said, we have this idea that we should not have these emotions,
Mm-hmm.
and people should not say unkind things, or people should not do or say anything that triggers us. And when we soften that, when we soften that idea that triggering shouldn't be, it shouldn't happen, you know, as I mentioned at the outset, that's the second arrow. And when we let go of that, then we can deal with triggering by some of the practices that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah. You know, I hadn't thought of that the way you put that, that we have like a global should or so many conditions, and that potentially changing your attitude about that in a global way could be helpful for all triggers. That I should be triggered, that triggers show where I'm holding on to something, and that I things should misfire, and technology shouldn't work, and politicians should lie, and the weather should rain on my parade. You know, that just changing it from shouldn't to should in that way can really soften our reaction to every trigger.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And if changing it from shouldn't to should is too big a step, a good intermediate step is, well, politicians do lie. The weather does turn bad. People do say things that hurt us. And I know sometimes this might sound cold, but one of my favorite techniques for that I call the SBFD, which is so big friggin' deal. So
Mhm.
so that happens. So I feel this way. So it's just that we have this idea that when we have this really strong emotion, it's going to kill us. And it
Mhm.
doesn't.
Well, not yet. You know, there's always a possibility.
Well, eventually, I suppose we all die, but I don't believe
And
it's from being triggered.
I don't know. Some people have said that they could die from embarrassment.
That's
You
right.
know,
But they don't.
they don't usually. Yeah. I wonder if there's any cases. He got embarrassed and then he just keeled over. And, anyways, so what we normally do with triggers is we blame. That's the tried and true method. We blame other people. We blame the trigger. We blame the situation. We don't see that really is something within us that has been triggered. You know, some string that has been plucked. We also deny triggers. Oh, that didn't bother me. You know, it's no big deal or whatever. And meanwhile, we're seething. And there's distraction, a tried and true American pastime, which I'm proud to be part of. And then there's rumination, just looping about it. You know, I find I was triggered by a politician yesterday, and something, you know, happened. He said stuff, and I was ruminating about it. I realized how much I liked ruminating about it. how much I liked making him wrong and feeling self-righteous indignation because I was clearly right and he was clearly wrong. And just going over and over of it in my head, I got more and more triggered as I listened to these thoughts. And I think that we don't ever realize that there are parts of us that like being triggered and like going over our triggers because we get to feel self-righteous.
Yes, and we don't realize that the price we pay for feeling self-righteous is the loss of our peace.
You had to
Uh,
throw that in. I was enjoying my self-righteousness, and then you just kind of threw that in, Brian. Yeah, yeah, you can't have both. What a drag. Oh well. But at least I was really I just admitting how much I'm enjoying my my suffering made it a little bit softer and made it so that I could let go of it more easily.
Oh, well, that's a good thing. If that happens, if it softens it, if, yeah, sometimes just knowing that that's what you do.
Yeah. And it's interesting. Once again, the spiritual group I was in, we had a technique that anytime you were triggered, you would point to what the shortcoming was in you that allowed you to be triggered, which was very humbling.
Yeah, but
And
that sounds like just another trigger to me. I mean, that I can't go along with that one.
well, it was
Okay,
challenging.
instead of letting this person trigger me, I'm going to trigger myself.
Well, not you weren't trying to trigger yourself. You're trying to see accurately. So let's say with this politician, I could blame it on the politician and say he's the problem, or I could say I have a tendency to really like self-righteousness and feeling superior to others, and that's why I am ruminating about this. That's
Okay,
another point of view.
okay, I could see that knowing that about yourself might help, but most triggers are that when people talk to me about being triggered, they're mostly talking about unkind things that other people say that bring them back to the pain of childhood and punishment from their parents.
Uh-huh.
And usually saying, okay, what is the flaw in me that has created this is, I think, counterproductive. That's just switching the blame from the parents to yourself and feeling that you're flawed, because what triggering does is it makes you feel unworthy, and the reaction then is defensiveness, and you're defending that idea about yourself that you are basically fundamentally flawed. So in my mind, any technique that reinforces the idea that you're basically fundamentally flawed is something to be avoided.
Well, we get to disagree, and I always enjoy when we get to disagree because we agree on so many things. Having and I will give the caveat that seeing your shortcoming instead of blaming is not for everyone, because some people then get into self-blame and that's not useful either. But I would say it's a alternate view of reality that can be very effective, because once you see that you're not a victim of outside events, but you're more a victim of inside conditioning, then there's a possibility of changing that conditioning, changing your rules for how things should be. And it gives you more empowerment because you're no longer in a situation where you're powerless.
Yes, I see that, and that makes sense to me. That switch from seeing the other, the outside person, the cause of the trigger as the problem, and looking inside and seeing that it is something, some defensiveness, some idea of how you should be that is really creating the triggered emotion. I think seeing that is really important, but I think it's just more nuanced than that. You have to see that what gets triggered is some part of you that's trying to protect the vulnerable inner child in you.
Hmm.
And so you have to be able to A, understand that that part of you is trying to protect you because it loves you, and B, you have to love that inner vulnerable child and nurture it and soothe it and send it as much love as possible. So if your technique leads to that, then great, that's fine. If it doesn't, I think it doesn't go far enough.
Good point. And so, and depending on when I did the technique, it sometimes did and sometimes didn't. I think that it is a better way to use that technique. The technique I was doing was more just seeing it as it is, but you do have to do it with compassion and love, or it then veers into self blame and inner dislike, which is never helpful.
Yeah, yeah, right. And I think that your list of things that don't work, blame, denial, rumination is very, very good. And I think particularly rumination, because what usually happens is we go into a big, long story. In other words, a dialogue in our minds about what that person shouldn't have done and how I feel and what I should do to make sure this never happens again, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And
And why we're right and they're wrong.
exactly, yeah, all of that stuff. And it's words in our head. And that is actually completely unhelpful.
Yeah, yeah. Unless you enjoy it, and if you enjoy it, enjoy your rumination, and write it for Walt's worth. But it does have, especially over time, and when you realize that's what you're doing, it starts to get old really quick. So let's talk about I came up with, or both of us came up with 8 ways to deal with triggers that are better than the blame, denial, distraction, and rumination. And the first way we talked about was to just dive into the sensations of the emotions that you're experiencing.
Yeah, that's excellent. And when you say sensations, you're talking about the physical sensations, how it feels in your body.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really great way.
Well, whether something's a great way depends on whether it works for you. That's my religion. I tell people when people ask, what's your spiritual beliefs or religion? I say, do what works for you. And I find that with certain emotions like anger, or annoyance, as I dive into the sensations, it tends to make me more angry. So I don't use it for that, and I think it can be very nuanced. So you have to find out which of these methods will go over, seem to work for you. And it can be even more nuanced than that. So if I dive into the sensations of sadness, that seems to uh, lead to a feeling of compassion and peace after a few moments. When I dive into the sensations of anger, it seems to lead to me being more angry. So I wouldn't call that a success in how to deal with my triggers, but that's just me. How about you?
No, it usually works pretty well for me, but diving into the sensations in your body, it has to preclude that rumination thing. In other
Yeah.
words, you have to consciously say, okay, I'm going to now ignore the words in my head, the inner dialogue. In other words,
Mhm.
if you don't do that, then yes, it's going into the feeling in your body. If you haven't quieted the rumination, it's gonna escalate.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And sometimes even if you do quiet, it could escalate. Maybe I'm unusual that way with anger, but I have noticed that that sometimes happens just through the sensations. Of course, another way of dealing with triggers is learning to let go of rumination and blame and such, and just letting go to a place of peace, which is kind of what the Sedona method is about, but also methods like your what we call raw exercise. Why don't you talk about that?
Sure, that's my basic exercise for all sorts of awareness practices, including triggering. RAA stands for sometimes you can call it rest as awareness, but in mine, it's relaxing, allowing, and awareing. And the first step is just physically relax, because the first thing that we do is we create a tense, rigid shell of defensiveness when we're triggered. And
Mhm.
just simply taking some deep breaths and relaxing the body and seeing in the body where that tension is and letting it go. That's a fantastic first step. And the second step is allowing, is the idea of maybe dropping your idea that this shouldn't be happening and just saying, okay, it is happening. Okay, anxiety is here. Triggering is here. This emotion is here. Take a breath. Why shouldn't it be? It is. Allow it. And then noticing that the pure awareness that you are already allows everything, like a clear mirror. So you identify with that. And that's really the third step, which is awareing, which is seeing yourself as the clear field of awareness that allows everything to be, and identifying with that and looking at the world from there.
Like be the background.
Yeah, be the
Yeah.
background.
Yeah. And that's a letting go. To do that, you're instead of focusing on the trigger, you're focusing on the relaxing, the allowing, and the awareing. And in a way, that's a switching your focus as a way of dealing with the trigger in a way that helps you to let go.
That's right. It's a shift of attention, as you say, a switching of focus. Absolutely right.
Mhm. Now, another way is maybe a more direct thing, which is you focus on awareness or you focus on what I would call presence. And we had a little bit of discussion about the difference between focusing on awareness and focusing on presence. And I define, well, I think hopefully people know what focusing on awareness is like, but focusing on presence is more like being in touch with your immediate environment. So when I focus on awareness, I'm more inner focused. When I focus on presence, I'm more noticing that there's a computer in front of me, that the room is good temperature, that light is streaming through, and it's a different focus, but it also helps me to let go of the trigger.
Yeah, I think that's a really good distinction. And I hadn't never really thought of it that way, because I thought that awareness and presence in my mind were the same. But as you describe it, I can see the distinction. And they both play into each other and can
Mhm.
come and can come in either order. In other words,
Yeah.
you can use presence to just take an inventory of what's in awareness now. There's the feeling of my body on the chair. There's a sound coming in. There's a breeze on my skin. And then you can ask, what is all this appearing in? Or in the reverse, let's say you've already stepped back, asked, what is my experience appearing in? Awareness, is that who I really am? And then you can turn around and look at presence, look at the breeze on your skin, the weight of your body on the chair, anything that's in awareness, and look at that from awareness and as awareness, and see that it's all the same. So I think presence is a good technique as you defined it.
Yeah, I really liked how you described those two and their relationship with each other, which is kind of like heads and tails of a coin.
Yeah,
You know, they're just two sides of the same coin in a certain way.
that's right.
Um,
And
Go
that's
on.
maybe not totally germane to today's topic, but I think it's important that you said that they're both sides of the same coin, because focusing on awareness or being awareness or identifying awareness does not mean transcending the world and not engaging with the world or somehow being above it all. It can include everything that you experience, and they are two sides of the same coin. The relative and the transcendent, the unified, are both. It's like duality and non-duality are all included in non-duality.
Mhm. You always have a poetic way of saying things. I appreciate. So You mentioned this technique earlier, the SBFD technique, and I think that goes along with my magical mantra known as blah blah blah, which is just putting these things in perspective. And you tell people what SBFD stands for.
So big freaking deal.
Right, right. And we don't really have that perspective enough in this society. I remember in Thailand when I was there, they have a term "mai pen rai," which you might have heard, which is basically means no big deal or it doesn't matter. And it was part of the cultural lexicon that you would hear, "My pen rai," so something would happen, you might uh bump something that falls over, and the clerk would say, "My pen rai." And we don't have the similar term. In some places they do have terms like that, but here we're going to have to create that term. So big freaking deal or blah 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 or whatever that helps you immediately get a perspective of something it's not that important.
Yeah, you're letting go of the idea that anything that is shouldn't be.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's helpful to have phrases. You might even create a phrase that works better for you. It's a big freaking deal. I'm not sure what another phrase would be, but I find that when I work with people in a therapy practice, that I sometimes tailor make phrases that really resonate with them. So big freaking deal, I like because it kind of has a humorous edge. Blah, blah, blah also has a humorous edge. I think when we're triggered, humor is one of the things that can really quickly give us perspective.
Yeah, I agree totally. It really does help and it lightens things. Another phrase that in this category that I find useful is Stuart Schwartz's technique, which I summarize basically as anger is here. Take a breath.
Mm, mm-hmm.
Substitute any emotion you might be feeling right now that you might have an idea shouldn't be. It is.
Uh-huh.
Triggering is here. Take a breath. And it also helps to be less identified with
Mm-hmm.
the emotion that you're experiencing.
Yeah. For some people, they'll use a phrase or a question like, will this matter in 5 years?
Yes.
I like the question because it makes me laugh. Will this matter in 10,000 years? Or those pictures you used to see of the Milky Way galaxy that would say, "You are here." There'd be a little point somewhere. And anything that helps you gain perspective like that can be kind of fun.
Yeah.
Uh, Another way of dealing with triggers is intentionally changing your state. This is something that people like Tony Robbins teach a lot. Also, Dr. Joe Dispenza does a lot of this, where you might focus on gratitude or what's good about something, or get into a more empowering state. And I think all of those can be very helpful as well.
Yeah, I think so too. Change agents. So would you include in intentional changing of state? You mentioned focusing on gratitude. Would you include appreciation, like music that you enjoy?
Yes, yes. Music you enjoy, watching a YouTube clip. These can get into the area of distraction sometimes, but if they're intentional as a tool, I think that they are potentially very effective and healthy.
I think so too, if they're intentional, and that is a good distinction that you make. And they're not distraction if you allow yourself to feel the feeling
Mm-hmm.
first. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
here it is. I feel it. Where in my body do I feel it? Just for now, can I allow it to be here? And then pull up a YouTube video that you know is going to make you laugh.
Yeah. You don't have to suffer for long, but you want to also not deny what's there.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can be a a challenging distinction to make. How
Mhm.
long do I say yes to it? And when is it no longer in any way serving me?
Yeah, that's right. But I like the changing of state, and particularly the focusing on gratitude.
Hmm.
Or it's actually similar in some ways to my include. Like, what else is here?
Hmm.
Okay, here's an emotion I don't like. I got triggered. Here's an emotion I don't like. What else is here? What else is in awareness right now? My God, that tree is beautiful, but there's a breeze on my skin. Look at how the floor and the earth supports my weight.
Yeah, the great thing about the include method is when we're triggered, it decreases our awareness and constricts it to a point of that's the only thing that's important. So you're actually refuting reality. And the include method is you're broadening and opening to more of reality. So it's not denying anything, it's just including more of what is.
That's right. And that emotion that you don't like, that you've been triggered to feel, becomes smaller in proportion to everything else you include.
Right, right. Another approach is, and I like this approach because it's a global approach, like changing your attitude about triggers. And really it's what I would call changing your attitude from like, oh no, to oh, here's an opportunity. And triggers are pointing to something, so they can always be seen as an opportunity. Or you often use triggers as a reminder. Maybe you talk more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I got into the habit a while back ago of using every time I have a feeling that I don't want, use that as a reminder to simply be awareness or to ask, in what does this appear? What
Mhm.
notices my experience? And when you get into the habit of that, it becomes second nature. So
Hmm.
the feeling happens, and then just by force of habit, because you've done it so often, you expand your identity to include the universe. And then that's just another appearance, like sound, like sights, just another experience, and it's allowed. And it's also very similar to Byron Katie's expression, I look forward to being triggered. I think you told me about that one when we last spoke.
Yeah, actually, I think of it as different than that because yours is you're using it as an alarm clock, whereas Byron Katie's thing is more of just changing your global attitude towards triggers from one of resistance to one of actually anticipation. And I like her statement, I look forward to that politician doing what he does, because then it kind of gets you in the right frame so that when that politician does what they do, you can kind of smile and go, oh, there it is. Yeah, okay, like that. And that's really changing your attitude or your disposition in a way that's likely to be helpful to you.
Yeah, yeah, I see that. I can see that. And it's kind of funny in a way too.
Yeah, yeah, it always makes me smile. I'm looking forward to my knee hurting. That that change. I need more practice with my knee hurting and accepting it. I'm sure my knee will be more than happy to oblige sometime soon. I look forward to that.
Mhm. Yep.
So, so yeah, those are, I don't know, like 7 or 8 different approaches to how to deal with triggers in a way that is more conscious than the way we normally do. And it would be nice if we had any of them as part of our culture. Like, unfortunately, we don't have any agreement. We do have the agreement that blame is kind of like our baseline. You know, if you that's the default for our culture.
Mhm.
And so people are always blaming something or someone, or that they're blameless. But it'd be nice if we had a cultural alternative that we all could go, well, instead of blame, you might think of this. but
It,
we don't.
it would be nice. And if we do come up with that, how would we spread that to everybody?
Well, there's this great podcast called Awareness Explorers that shares ideas like this, and maybe we could force everybody to listen to it.
Well, we could,
Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. So I think we'll just have to share it with you can make deals with people around you that they hear you blaming. I think, reminders from other people that are around you. And that's why it's good to share these podcasts, is that it's helpful if you have shared understanding with your friends or your mate that they can remind you of these ideas when you are triggered.
yeah, yeah, I think that that can be very useful. Reminders from others and reminders from just your own life, and just setting up little reminders like when this happens, try one of these techniques, whichever works for you.
Yeah, I do that. I have a little post-it note with reminders around my house, and like I have to use the Sedona method at least 5 times this week. I have little circles as to each time I use it, and I cross it off, and that's been helpful because when you're triggered, part of being triggered is it usually comes with losing your consciousness and not remembering some of these things. So you need those little helpers, either from other people or visual reminders or whatever, to help you when you are triggered.
Yeah, and now that you mentioned the Sedona method, I just want to briefly, in case most people know what it is, but in the context of this, it's asking simple questions like, can I let go of control? Can I let go of wanting to be safe? And can I let go of, what's the other one?
Letting go of approval.
Approval. Right.
And just to add to that, it, I usually put a time limit on it. Could I let go of needing approval just for the next 30 seconds?
Yeah, smart.
So thank you for that approval. It didn't help me let go of my need for it, but I appreciate the approval anyways. Uh, Anything else about triggers that comes up before we do a guided meditation?
Well, no, just the very last thing, which is actually what the guided meditation is about, which is the principle, when in doubt, love.
Mm.
And we're
Mhm.
talking about loving yourself in terms of triggering, loving yourself because that's what is harmed. But also, if possible, love your triggerer. Just, or whatever this means to you. When in doubt, love.
Yeah, you can't go wrong with that. And a lot of people who are very awake say that one of the things that helped them to be awake was loving the parts of themselves that were triggered.
Yes, that's right. Loving the parts of yourself that were triggered. And usually, well, as we mentioned at the beginning, triggering is, oh, sorry, I'm laughing because all of a sudden a bunch of balloons flew up on your screen.
All right, right, which means that the universe was agreeing with us.
Um, so triggering awakens that basic feeling that you are fundamentally flawed, and loving yourself and nurturing yourself and caring for that wounded inner child is really important at that time. And saying, yeah, okay, so you deserve all the love. You're not bad. This is
Yeah.
not about you being fundamentally bad. It's really about love.
Speaking of love, I think you have a lovely guided meditation for us.
Sure. Shall I just dive into it now?
Absolutely.
Okay, here goes. First, as always, take a nice, easy, deep breath and relax. In this meditation, we'll be remembering a triggering event in the past, but it would be great if you saved it and replayed it again shortly after a new triggering happens. But for now, remember a time that you've been triggered in the recent past. Remember the emotions that arose around it. If it helps to remember a bit of the story around it in order to bring up the feeling vividly, then do that. But then drop the story about it and simply notice what's happening in your body. Notice that there's a tightness. Let's call it defensiveness. Notice defensiveness is here, and take another breath. When triggering happens, there are often two arrows. I call them the double arrows of suffering. The first arrow is the trigger, that hurtful thing that someone has said or done that makes you feel unworthy, that makes you feel vulnerable, that makes you feel 2 years old. The second arrow is the idea that you shouldn't have gotten triggered. Memories of the first arrow have led us to build defensive armor around ourselves to protect us from it. We fear that if the arrow gets through the armor and penetrates our heart, we'll die. But what is your heart? What is the universal symbol of the heart? It's the same as the universal symbol of love. So let's take a moment to turn your attention toward your heart and envision it as that symbol of love within your chest. Imagine it as pure love. Love of yourself, love of others, love of your vulnerable self, love of your triggerer. Imagine that loving heart as unconditional love. It loves no matter what. It loves all. It loves whatever happens. It loves your pain. It loves your vulnerability. It loves you unconditionally. Spend a few moments to really feel that love and let it spread and widen. Love it back. Soothe it and comfort it if it's in pain. The more you love it, the more it loves you. Love it even when it's broken. Love it when it's trying to protect you. Why would it want to protect you? Because it loves you. Love it. Feel the love. Now, drop the second arrow. Drop the idea that you should never be triggered. Let the first arrow crack the armor into 1,000,000 pieces and pierce your heart. Let the arrow trigger that love. Imagine the arrow is pressing the button of love that increases it and makes it grow and grow and glow and glow with warm, welcoming, nurturing self-love. Every trigger is an opportunity to let the armor crack and let the arrow pierce the heart of love, and in turn, trigger the growing, glowing warmth that is the loving nature of your heart. When you relax the tightness of your armor and allow yourself to feel the arrow piercing your heart, you don't die. You trigger love. Allowing yourself to feel the pain is loving yourself. When you're really relaxed, the pain doesn't get trapped inside the armor. It comes in, it triggers the love in your heart, and it leaves. Let it come. Love it. Let it go. Now, take another nice, easy, deep breath. And when it feels comfortable, begin to open your eyes.
That was beautiful. I particularly liked what you said at the end as a kind of a summary. Let it come, love it, and let it go.
Thank you. Yeah,
Very creative and very helpful.
I'm glad to hear it. I hope it is helpful, because I know that a lot of people go through life suffering because of these triggers, and there's a way out of that suffering.
Mm-hmm. Or there are 8 ways out of that suffering that we discussed today. So
That's right.
if you like this episode or this podcast, please pass it on. And once again, I want to thank our Patreon supporters. And if you're interested in supporting us, go to patreon.com/awareness explorers. Any
Yeah.
last words, Brian?
Now that you mentioned Patreon, every once in a while, we send extra stuff to our Patreon supporters, usually about once a month, which is often like little outtakes and excerpts from our interviews with guests. And every once in a while, I get an email saying that the email bounced. So sometimes people put in different email addresses in their Patreon. So just go and check your Patreon account and see if the email address you have for Patreon is a current one so that you get our stuff. That's if you're not getting our stuff and you're a Patreon supporter, that would be the thing to do.
Yeah. And so because I'm very powerful, I'm going to send a bunch of our listeners triggers this week with the hope that you will use some of the ideas that we talked about this week and that you will get proficient at them and then you will become more and more free. So when you get the triggers this week, no need to thank me. I just do that generosity in my heart, and I hope you make good use of them.
Well, I look forward to it.
Oh, yes, yes, using the Brian Cady technique. Look forward to those triggers. Until next time, keep exploring.
Keep exploring.
Thank you for listening to Awareness Explorers. To learn more, you can check out our website at awarenessexplorers.com. Please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast app. We'd love it if you would post a review. And please share our link on Facebook and with family and friends, because knowing yourself as awareness is the greatest gift you can give yourself or someone you love.